Every candle in the ranch house was lit the night she finally came back from the ridge, and Joel Fairchild stood in the doorway with his heart hammering so hard against his ribs he thought the whole valley must have heard it. He had lit every single one himself, working his way from room to room in the blue dark of that October evening, touching flame to wick with hands that would not stop shaking, because he had not known whether she was coming back alive or coming back at all. 3 days. 3 days since Georgia Hayes had ridden up toward Copper Ridge alone, with nothing but a canteen, a Winchester, and a secret she had refused to share with a living soul. 3 days since he had last seen her face, and in that time something inside him had cracked open like dry earth in a drought, exposing roots he had not known were there. When her horse, the big roan she called Juniper, finally crested the near hill and came down through the amber grass toward the gate, Joel nearly dropped the last candle he was holding. He set it instead on the porch rail, very carefully, the way a man sets down a thing he is afraid to break, and he walked out into the yard to meet her. She looked like she had fought the ridge, and the ridge had fought back. Her dark hair was loose and tangled with pine needles. Her left sleeve was torn at the shoulder. There was a dried cut along her jaw that made his stomach clench with a rage so clean and cold it felt almost like prayer. But she was upright in the saddle. Her brown eyes found his across the distance of the yard, and whatever was in her expression, it was not relief. It was something harder and more complicated than relief, something that had been worn smooth by 3 days of wind and decision, and Joel understood in that moment that whatever she had gone up to Copper Ridge to resolve, she had resolved it. For better or for worse, something was settled. He took Juniper's bridle without a word. He held the horse steady while Georgia swung down, and when her boots hit the dirt and her knees buckled just slightly, he caught her arm with a grip that was perhaps firmer than it needed to be and perhaps not firm enough. "You're back," he said. The words were stupid and small. They were also the only words he had left. "I'm back," she said. Her voice was hoarse and low. She looked up at him in the wash of candlelight spilling through every window of the ranch house, and for one long, terrible moment, he thought she was going to tell him something that would end him. Then her face changed. The hard, worn smoothness cracked open just as his chest had cracked open, and what came out of her was not a confession or a goodbye. It was a single, shaking breath, and then she pressed her forehead against his shoulder and closed her eyes. Joel wrapped both arms around her and stood in the candle-lit dark of the yard and did not say a single word, because some moments are too large for language and too fragile for anything but stillness. He had not always known that. He had learned it from her. To understand Georgia Hayes and what she had gone to find on Copper Ridge, and why Joel Fairchild had lit every candle he owned to bring her home, you have to go back 8 months to the morning she first rode into Redemption, Wyoming, on a borrowed horse with a carpetbag strapped behind the saddle, and a face that gave away nothing at all. It was the spring of 1882, and Redemption sat in the Wind River Basin like something a man had built out of stubbornness rather than common sense, which was, in fact, exactly what had happened. The town had 3 saloons, a general store owned by a woman named Hazel Prout who tolerated no nonsense, a livery, a land office, a post office that doubled as a barber shop, and a church whose congregation was more enthusiastic than its roof. The surrounding ranches were a patchwork of ambition and exhaustion, some of them prospering, some of them bleeding out slowly from drought and bad luck, and the kind of debt that followed a family from one generation to the next like a bad reputation. Joel Fairchild's ranch was called the Double F. It sat 7 miles south of town, along the fork of a creek that ran cold and clear off the Wind River Range, and in the spring of 1882, it was the most precarious thing he owned, which was saying something because he also owned a heart that had been precarious for a long time. He had built the Double F from nothing. He had come to Wyoming at the age of 24, 10 years before our story begins, with $200, a working knowledge of cattle, and a determination so fierce it occasionally frightened people. By the time he was 30, he had a proper ranch house, 400 head of cattle, 2 hired hands, and a reputation throughout the basin as a man who was fair, capable, and absolutely impossible to rattle. What the basin did not know, because Joel did not speak of it, was that the ranch house had been built for a woman who had never lived in it. Her name had been Alice, and she had agreed to come west with him and then, 3 weeks before the journey, had married a banker in her hometown of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, without so much as a letter of explanation. Joel had built the house anyway, because by then the foundation was dug and the timber was cut, and he was not the kind of man who left things unfinished. But there were rooms in it that had never quite been claimed by living, rooms that echoed slightly, rooms that a man could sit in at night and feel the particular silence of something that had never arrived. He had not been bitter. That was important to understand. He had grieved what he thought his life was supposed to be, and then he had folded that grief away into a back drawer of himself and gotten on with the business of surviving, which in Wyoming in the 1880s took up most of a person's available attention. But he had also, very quietly, stopped expecting anything to come of the empty rooms. Then Georgia Hayes rode into Redemption. He did not meet her the day she arrived. He was out on the range with his foreman, a compact and weather-beaten man named Cal Briggs, checking the upper fence line after a hard spring storm. And by the time he came back to town for supplies 2 days later, Georgia had already established herself at Hazel Pruitt's boarding house and taken a position as a teacher at the Redemption schoolhouse, filling the vacancy left by the previous teacher, Mr. Aldous Kemp, who had departed under circumstances that the town preferred not to discuss in detail. Joel saw her for the first time at the general store. She was standing at the counter with a list in her hand, and she was arguing with Hazel Pruitt's nephew, a lazy young man named Bertram who occasionally helped at the counter and overcharged people he thought would not notice. "The chalk is 15 cents a box," Bertram was saying, with the particular smug confidence of someone who believes he holds all the cards. "The price board behind you says 12 cents, Georgia said. She was not raising her voice. She did not appear to be angry. She was simply stating a fact with the calm precision of a woman who had learned long ago that facts, stated clearly enough, could win most arguments without any dramatics at all. Bertram glanced at the price board, saw that she was correct, and attempted to recover his dignity by claiming the board was out of date. Georgia reached into her bag and produced a copy of the Regional Supply Catalog, opened to the relevant page, and placed it on the counter with a quiet finality that made Joel, standing 2 feet away with a bag of flour under his arm, want to applaud. She was 26 years old, he would learn later. She was tall for a woman of the era. With dark hair she kept pinned up in public, brown eyes that assessed things quickly and missed very little, and a way of standing that suggested she had once been accustomed to a great deal of uncertainty and had decided somewhere along the way to stop letting it move her. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way the dime novels described women, soft-featured and doe-eyed. She was striking. She was the kind of woman whose face you remembered because of what moved across it rather than its arrangement, and what was moving across it at present was a patient, implacable determination to pay 12 cents for chalk. Bertram charged her 12 cents. She collected her purchase, turned from the counter, and found Joel standing directly behind her. "Excuse me," she said, stepping aside to let him pass. "No, please," he said. "I was just waiting. Take your time." She looked at him for a moment. It was not a long look. It was the kind of look a person gives when they are performing a quick and accurate calculation. "You're not from the store," she said. "No, ma'am, I'm a customer, Joel Fairchild. I run the Double F Ranch south of town." Georgia Hayes. She did not offer her hand, which was not unusual for the era, but there was something in the withholding that he noted without pressing. "I've taken the teaching position. I heard." "Welcome to Redemption." "Thank you." She looked at the flower under his arm. Is that the last of the 50-pound bags? I need to send a box of supplies to the school, and I was hoping to include some flour for the Hendricks children. They've been coming without lunches. He looked at the bag. He looked at her. He said, without quite deciding to, take it. I can come back for another. She studied him again with that quick, calculating look. You don't have to do that. I know, I'm offering. Something small moved through her expression. It was not quite a smile. It was the precursor to a smile, the place where a smile started in a person who had learned to be careful about showing them. That's very kind, Mr. Fairchild, she said. How much do I owe you? Nothing. Welcome to redemption, he said again and handed her the flower. She took it without further protest, which told him she was practical as well as proud, because most people with pride that size would have refused the gesture on principle. As she walked out of the store, Hazel Prude appeared from the back room, looked at Joel, looked at the door Georgia had just gone through, and gave him a look that contained an entire editorial. Don't, he said. I didn't say a word, Hazel said. You were about to say several words. I was going to say that she's had a hard time of it, Hazel said, and the teasing left her voice entirely, replaced by something careful and measured. She came from Laramie originally, before that somewhere back east. She doesn't talk about it and I don't push, but Joel, she's had a hard time. He nodded and went about his business, but he thought about that on the ride home. He thought about the way she had argued about the chalk price without a tremor of uncertainty, and the way she had looked at him, as though she were making sure he could be trusted before she accepted anything from him, and the way she had known immediately that the Hendricks children needed flour. He thought about what kind of life taught a person to move through the world with that combination of capability and guardedness. He did not see her again for 2 weeks, and he used those 2 weeks to firmly tell himself that he was not thinking about Georgia Hayes, and that the rooms in his house were fine the way they were. When he did see her again, it was at the Riley's place, which was 3 miles east of town, and had been the site of Redemption's irregular social gatherings since before Joel had arrived in the basin. The Rileys were a large Irish family, second-generation Wyoming, and they threw barn dances and harvest suppers with an enthusiasm that was contagious even to people who generally preferred their own company, which included both Joel Fairchild and, it turned out, Georgia Hayes. She was standing near the edge of the lantern light with a cup of something warm, talking to Clara Riley, who was 17 and worshipful of anyone who seemed to have a plan for their life. Joel watched from across the barn for longer than he probably should have before Cal Briggs materialized at his elbow and said, in a voice entirely devoid of subtlety, "Go talk to her." "I've met her," Joel said. "Talking to a woman once about flour doesn't count as a social life," Cal said. Joel went and talked to her. What happened was that he meant to stay for 5 minutes and instead stayed for 2 hours. Because Georgia Hayes turned out to be a person who had read more books than most people in the Wind River Basin had ever seen, had strong and well-reasoned opinions about everything from cattle grazing rotation to the territorial legislature to the novels of Mr. Charles Dickens, and laughed at something he said about 3/4 of the way through their conversation, in a way that was sudden and unguarded, and completely at odds with the careful, measured way she did everything else. He drove her back to Hazel's in his wagon that night. The Wind River Mountains were blue against the dark sky to the west, and the night smelled of pine and cold water and the distant cook fire of someone camped along the creek. She sat beside him on the wagon seat and did not talk much on the drive, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had said enough for the time being and were content to let the night carry the rest. At the boarding house gate, she stepped down from the wagon and turned to thank him, and there was a moment, brief and significant, where the candlelight from Hazel's front window caught her face and she looked at him with that quick assessing look, and then she looked down at her own hands and he had the strong impression that she was deciding something. "I'll be at the store Thursday morning," she said, "if you need anything from town." "I might," he said. "I usually do." "Thursday morning then," she said and went inside. He sat in the wagon for a moment in the dark before clicking to the horses, and he thought about the empty rooms in his house, and this time the thought did not ache the way it usually did. What followed was 4 months of something so careful and deliberate it was almost painful, because they were both people who had learned to be careful and deliberate, and neither of them wanted to be the one to move too quickly and break what was building. They met on Thursdays at the store. They rode together on Sundays, first with Clara Riley as an unofficial but enthusiastic chaperone, and then eventually without, because Clara had developed an absorbing interest in the blacksmith's youngest son and had transferred her attentions accordingly. They talked about everything. Georgia told him about growing up in Cincinnati with a father who had been a school teacher and a mother who had died when she was 9, about the years of careful living that had followed, about coming west to Laramie at 23 for reasons she did not detail, and arriving in Redemption for reasons she also did not detail, but about which he had begun to form a shape from the silences around them. He told her things he had not told anyone in Redemption, about Alice, about the house built for a woman who never came, about the 10 years of filling himself up with work until the empty rooms in his actual heart stopped being something he noticed every morning. He did not tell her these things all at once. He told them to her in pieces, the way you can only safely tell the things you carry, a little at a time, over long evenings on the porch and long rides along the creek. She listened the way she did everything, with full and focused attention, not performing sympathy but actually receiving what he was giving her. And one evening in late July, after he had told her more than he had intended to about the night he had finished building the bedroom and realized he was going to sleep in it alone, she had been quiet for a long moment and then said, "I was married, in Laramie, for 14 months. He had suspected something like this. He waited. His name was Fletcher Hayes," she said. Her voice was level, but the effort of keeping it level was audible to him by now. "He was charming and plausible, and I was 23 and had been careful my whole life, and I was tired of being careful." She turned her cup in her hands. "He was also a man who believed very strongly that a woman's opinions, a woman's property, and a woman's body all belonged to her husband, and he was willing to enforce that belief with whatever was necessary." Joel's hands were very still on the porch rail. He waited. "He died," she said, "in the spring of 1881. His horse threw him on the Laramie Road and he broke his neck." She said this with a flatness that was not cruelty but was rather the complete exhaustion of grief that had not been simple grief because the person who had died had been a person who hurt you, and the world expected you to mourn cleanly and you could not. "I left Laramie 6 weeks later. I came here." She paused. "I did not come here to tell anyone any of this." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you because you've told me things," she said, and there was something almost fragile in the precision of that statement, the way it was both an offering and a boundary all at once. "Georgia," he said. "Don't say you're sorry," she said quickly. "I know you mean it kindly, but I cannot hear one more person being sorry." "I wasn't going to say I'm sorry," he said. "I was going to say thank you for telling me." She turned to look at him. The summer dark was full of crickets and the creek muttered over its stones somewhere below, and she looked at him for a long moment with those brown eyes that missed nothing, and then she said, with a roughness she probably had not intended, "You are a good man, Joel Fairchild." He had not thought of himself as a good man in a way that felt true in a very long time, because good men, in his private reckoning, did not build houses for women who had never agreed to live in them and then spend 10 years quietly nursing a wound they refused to name. He thought about saying this. Instead he said, "I'm trying." She smiled then. Fully, not the precursor to a smile but the real thing, sudden and warm and gone too quickly, and it went into him like a nail goes into green wood, clean and deep and permanent. He was in love with her by August. He knew it the way you know a thing you have been knowing for a while but refused to certify. He knew it the morning she arrived at the Double F to help him with the schoolhouse fundraiser accounts, because she had better figures than anyone in the valley, And she walked through his front door for the first time and stood in the front room and looked around at the high pine ceilings and the stone fireplace and the good solid furniture he had built himself. And she said, "You built all of this yourself?" And he said yes. And she ran her hand along the mantelpiece the way you touch a thing you are genuinely moved by. And he could not look at her face because what would have been on his own face was too much to show her yet. He loved her and he did not tell her, because she had told him about Fletcher Hayes, and he understood that the worst thing he could do was push. She needed to come to him at her own speed in her own time, and he was patient. He had built a ranch from nothing. He knew how to wait for something to grow. What he had not anticipated was the arrival of Cormac Slade. Cormac Slade came to Redemption in September of 1882 on a tall black horse with a silver-fitted saddle and the easy, confident bearing of a man who was accustomed to being looked at. He was handsome in a way that was immediately apparent and held no surprises, strong-jawed and well-dressed, with pale gray eyes and a way of entering a room that filled it. He said he was a land investor from Denver, assessing properties in the basin for purchase. He stayed at the Saloon Hotel and drank good whiskey and shook everyone's hand twice. He met Georgia on his second day in Redemption, at the post office. He was charming to her. He was charming the way a practiced man is charming, with attention and flattery deployed like tools. And Joel, who saw it happen from across the street, recognized it with a cold shock of recognition, because he had heard Georgia describe Fletcher Hayes, and the description rhymed uncomfortably with what he was looking at. What Joel did not know, what Georgia had not told anyone, and was in fact the secret she had carried from Laramie like a stone in her chest, was that she knew Cormac Slade. Not as an acquaintance. As the man who had been Fletcher Hayes's closest associate, his silent partner in a land scheme in Laramie County that had defrauded 3 ranching families of their properties through forged deeds and false liens. She had known about the scheme. She had tried to stop it. She had been silenced in ways she did not want to name, and when Fletcher died, Cormac Slade had looked at her across her husband's grave with those pale gray eyes and said, very quietly, that the documentation she had removed from Fletcher's desk would be very bad for her if it became known that she had taken it, and that she should think very carefully about her future. She had thought very carefully. She had come to Wyoming and said nothing and tried to build a life from the rubble of the previous one, and for 14 months in Redemption she had almost believed she had gotten far enough away. Then Cormac Slade walked into her post office. She did not run. She was 34 miles from the nearest telegraph station and Slade was between her and the road, and running would have told him she was frightened. And if there was one thing Georgia Hayes had learned, it was not to let a man know he had frightened you, because the knowledge of it made them larger. She gave him a polite blank look of non-recognition and said she was sorry, had they met. And he had smiled and said no, of course not. He was new to the territory and they had shaken hands, and she had walked away down the street and turned into the alley behind the dry goods store and stood against the brick wall breathing. She needed to think. She needed to decide. She had the documents still. 4 pages of paper in a locked box under the floorboard of her room at Hazel's. The paper trail of everything Slade and Hayes had done in Laramie. Enough to bring a federal land fraud case if she could get them to the right hands. She had kept them as protection. She had also kept them because 3 families had lost their land and someone should know the truth, even if she was not yet brave enough to be the one to tell it. She went to see Joel that evening. She came out to the Double F on Juniper and found him on the porch mending harness in the last of the daylight, and she sat on the porch steps and looked at the mountains and thought about telling him everything. She had the words assembled. She had the shape of the confession ready. And then she thought about what telling him would mean, what it would put him in the middle of, and the thought of Cormac Slade with his pale gray eyes turning that well-deployed attention on Joel Fairchild made her put the words away. Instead she said, "That man from Denver, Slade, what do you know about him?" Joel set the harness down. He gave her a look that was careful in a specific way, a way that said he had noticed something and was not sure yet how much to press. Land investor is what he says. Cal doesn't trust him. Neither do I. Why not? Men who are what they say they are don't need to make sure everyone knows it, Joel said. She nodded. She turned the information over. She said as casually as she could manage, "What's he looking at buying?" Saying he's interested in the Alderman parcel. 30 acres up on Copper Ridge with a creek right of way. He paused. "Georgia, what's this about?" "Nothing," she said, and he let her have the lie because he knew she needed it, but she felt him not believing it the way you feel a hand not quite touching your shoulder. She went home and she went to bed and she lay in the dark and thought about the locked box under the floorboard and the 3 families in Laramie County who had lost everything. And she thought about what it would cost her to finally do what she had never quite found the courage to do with those documents. And she thought about the look on Joel Fairchild's face when he said he was trying to be a good man. And she knew she was in love with him, had known it for weeks. And knowing it made what she was about to decide either easier or harder, she could not tell which. She decided in the first hour before dawn. She got up and she dressed and she wrote a note. Not to Hazel and not to Joel but to Hazel, asking her to please tell Mr. Fairchild that she had gone to the ridge on a personal matter and would be back in 3 days. She retrieved the locked box from under the floorboard. She saddled Juniper in the gray Pre-Dawn, and she rode north out of Redemption, past the church with its hopeful crooked steeple, and up into the Wind River foothills toward Copper Ridge. What she was going to do on the ridge was this. The federal land office had an inspector stationed at a town called Creston, 18 miles north through the hills. His name was Agent Marcus Webb, and Georgia had written to him twice in the past year, anonymous letters, careful and indirect, enough to tell him that the Laramie County fraud case deserved another look. She had never signed her name. She had never offered the documents. Now she was going to do both. The ride to Creston through the hills was not simple. The trail went up through pine timber and across a rocky shoulder of the ridge that made the footing treacherous in the early morning dark. And by the time the sun was fully up, she was high enough that the wind had real teeth in it. She made Creston late on the first day, stiff and saddle-sore, and found Agent Webb at the land office, a dry, compact man of middle age with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the look of someone who had been skeptical of things for so long it had become his natural expression. She gave him her name. She gave him the documents. She told him everything, beginning with the night she had found the forged deeds in Fletcher's desk and ending with Cormac Slade's appearance in Redemption. Agent Webb listened without expression, made notes, asked questions that told her he knew far more about the Laramie fraud than she had expected, and then told her that Cormac Slade had been under federal investigation for 8 months, and that her documents were, in his dry, precise language, extremely significant. He also told her that Slade would need to be taken into custody before he was aware that the evidence had been formalized, and that this needed to happen within 48 hours before he moved on to his next mark, which, according to their investigation, was indeed the Alderman parcel and the ranching families whose creek right-of-way it controlled. She rode back faster than she had ridden out. She had given Agent Webb everything. The stone she had been carrying from Laramie was gone from her chest. In its place was something she barely recognized at first, something light and clean and terrifying, which turned out on examination to be the feeling of not being afraid anymore. Or rather, of still being afraid but having decided to step forward anyway, which was a different thing entirely. The second night she made camp on the ridge proper, in the timber below the rocky shoulder, and she sat by a small fire she was careful to keep low, and she thought about Joel Fairchild and the things she had not said on his porch. She thought about what it would mean to be a woman who had come through what she had come through and was choosing, with full information and clear eyes, to love someone. Not being swept into it, not being maneuvered into it, not being too tired or too young or too longing for safety to see what she was choosing. actually choosing. The wind came down from the ridge in the middle of that night, with a force that extinguished the fire and startled Juniper badly enough that the roan pulled the picket stake, and Georgia had to chase her through the dark timber for 40 minutes, which explained the torn sleeve and the cut on her jaw, the latter from a pine branch she had walked into full face in the dark. She caught Juniper eventually, settled her down, and spent the remaining hours of the night huddled in her coat against a windbreak of boulders, too cold to sleep but warm enough in the particular interior warmth of a person who has made a necessary decision and is at peace with it. She came down from the ridge on the third day. She came down through the amber grass in the late afternoon, with the sun going down behind the wind rivers and the sky the color of hammered copper, and when she crested the near hill above the double F and saw every window of the ranch house blazing with candlelight, warm and gold against the coming dark, her throat closed completely, because she understood what that meant. She understood that Joel Fairchild had sat in that house for 3 days not knowing whether she was safe, not knowing what she was doing, not even knowing why she had gone, and his answer to not knowing had been to light every candle he owned and wait. She sat Juniper at the top of the hill for just a moment, looking down at that house full of light, and she pressed her closed fist against her mouth for just a second, because you have to give grief and love and relief somewhere to go before they overflow. Then she rode down. Now we are back in the candlelit yard, with Joel's arms around her and her forehead against his shoulder, and the roan standing patient behind them in the dark. She stayed there for a moment that was long enough to feel like an arrival, and then she straightened, because she was not a woman who stayed in shelter when she had things to say. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. He had not moved his hands from her arms. "All of it," she said. "Fletcher, Laramie, why Slade is here, what I went to do on the ridge, all of it, and I need you to hear it before anything else." "Then come inside," he said, "where it's warm." They went inside. The ranch house was extraordinary in the candlelight, every room glowing, the stone fireplace throwing red warmth into the front room, and she looked at it all and felt it again, the same thing she had felt when she crested the hill and saw the windows blazing. Some people built houses. Some people built houses and then filled them with light for you to come home to. She sat at the long kitchen table and he put coffee on the stove and he sat across from her, and she told him everything. All of it, beginning to end. The forged deeds in Fletcher's hand on her wrist and the documents, and the anonymous letters and Slade walking into her post office with those pale gray eyes, and the ride to Creston and Agent Webb and the documents, finally in the right hands, and the 40 minutes chasing Juniper through dark timber. He listened the way she had always known he would, which was completely, with his elbows on the table and his dark eyes steady on her, and nothing on his face that was pity or alarm or the particular male variety of outrage that was more about his own feelings than about hers. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment, and then he said, "Webb will move on Slade within today or tomorrow." He said 48 hours. "I was 2 days riding back, so it should be today." "All right," he said. "Then we wait for word." He poured her coffee and pushed the cup across the table and then said, "Georgia." "Yes. I'm going to say something and I need you to hear it as what it is, which is the plain truth and nothing else." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "Go ahead." "You carried that alone for over a year," he said. "You came here alone, you kept it alone, you went up to that ridge alone, and I understand why, all of it I do. But I want you to know going forward that you don't have to carry things alone. Not while I'm here." He paused. "That's not a threat and it's not a condition, it's a fact. I'm here." The candlelight was all around them and the fire was warm and the coffee was hot, and she had been cold and frightened and purposeful for 3 days, and she was so tired, and his face across the table from her was the most reliable thing she had ever looked at. "Joel," she said. "Yes. I am in love with you," she said. "I have been for some time. I want you to know that now, tonight, before any more time passes." He looked at her for a long moment, and what was on his face was not surprise. It was the expression of a man who has been holding a breath for a very long time and has just been given permission to exhale. "I've been in love with you since July," he said. "Maybe before." "Since July," she repeated. "Probably since the chalk," he admitted, and she laughed, the same sudden unguarded laugh he had first heard at the Riley barn dance, and this time it lasted longer and he watched it happen with a feeling in his chest like something being set to rights. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand turned over and held hers, and they sat like that in the candle-lit kitchen, while the coffee cooled and the fire crackled, and the night settled quietly around the ranch house. And for the first time in a very long time, possibly the first time in her adult life, Georgia Hayes was exactly where she had chosen to be. Cormac Slade was arrested by Agent Marcus Webb and 2 deputy marshals the following morning, just as the dawn was coming up gray and cold over the eastern plains. They took him out of the Saloon Hotel in handcuffs with the silver-fitted saddle still draped over the hitching rail outside, and the town of Redemption watched through various curtains and windows with a gratified lack of surprise, because the general consensus had been that a man that polished had to be hiding something rough underneath. The charges were federal land fraud and the forgery of territorial deed documents across 3 counties in Wyoming and Colorado. The documents Georgia had delivered to Agent Webb were central to the case and were subsequently entered into federal court records in Cheyenne. The 3 Laramie County families who had lost their properties received a protracted legal process, as such things went in the 1880s, but the outcome, 3 years later, was the return of their land titles and a financial settlement from the federal government that, while not extravagant, was enough to allow them to continue ranching. Georgia learned of this in a letter from Agent Webb in the autumn of 1885, and she sat on the double F porch and read it twice and then sat very still for a moment with her eyes closed, and when she opened them she was done carrying it. But that was later. In the October of 1882, the morning after she came down from the ridge and every candle in the ranch house had been burning for her, she woke in the small room Hazel Prout had assigned her and lay looking at the ceiling and felt, for the first time, the particular clean sensation of a future that was actually open. She and Joel rode into town together that day to hear the news of Slade's arrest, and as they rode side by side down the main street with the October cottonwoods blazing yellow and the sky an impossible blue above the mountains, Cal Briggs saw them coming from the livery door and looked at Joel with a questioning expression, and Joel looked back at him with an expression that answered it, and Cal went back into the livery whistling. "Your foreman is pleased with himself," Georgia said. "He's been pleased with himself since August," Joel said. "He thinks he's responsible." "He told you to go talk to me at the Riley barn dance," she said. Joel turned to look at her. "How do you know that?" "Clara Riley told me. She thought it was romantic. She told everyone." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was going to come talk to you anyway." "I know," she said. "I saw you looking from across the barn for a full 10 minutes. His face did something that was not quite a grimace and not quite a smile. "I was working up to it." "You were overthinking it," she said. "Very possibly," he agreed, and she smiled at the mountains and thought that this, exactly this, the banter and the ease of it and the way he could be laughed at without diminishing, was part of what she had been falling toward without knowing she was falling. What followed in the months after October was the slow and deliberate and joyful process of 2 careful people who had finally stopped being careful. Not carelessly, not recklessly, but with the particular courage of people who had been afraid long enough to know that fear was no reason not to live. He asked her to marry him in December in the ranch house, by the fireplace, with a plain gold ring he had ordered from the jeweler in Lander because Redemption's general store did not carry jewelry, and he had not wanted a makeshift ring for a question this important. She had known it was coming. She had not known how moved she would be when it came, how her throat would close and her eyes would fill, not with sadness but with the specific emotion of having arrived somewhere you had stopped believing existed. She said yes. She said it immediately and clearly, without qualification or hesitation. And then she said, because she was Georgia Hayes and she said the things she felt precisely, "I want you to know that I am saying yes because I want to, not because I need anything from you, not because I'm afraid of anything, not because I'm tired. I'm saying yes because you are the best man I have ever known and I love you with my entire heart." He stood up from where he had been kneeling and he held her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long time, and then he said, "I know. That's why I asked." They were married in February of 1883, at the Redemption Church under its crooked, hopeful roof, which had in fact been repaired over the winter through a community effort led primarily by Hazel Prout, who took the occasion of Georgia and Joel's engagement as a personal responsibility and organized a roof raising with the same efficiency she brought to everything. The congregation was not large by Eastern standards, but it was the entire town, packed into the pews and spilling out the double doors in coats and scarves in the cold February morning, because the town of Redemption had been rooting for this in the particular way small communities root for the happiness of people they have decided belong to them. Georgia wore a dress of deep blue wool, not a traditional white gown because traditional white gowns were impractical, and she was not a traditional white gown sort of woman. And she walked down the aisle beside Hazel Prout, who stood in for any family she might have had. And Joel stood at the front of the church with Cal Briggs beside him, and an expression on his face that Cal would later describe to his wife as a man who has just realized he has everything. The minister read the vows and they said them. And when Joel put the plain gold ring on her finger, she looked up at him, and the thing on her face was not the performed emotion of a wedding but something real and direct, the same way she did everything, and the thing on his face in return was the same. They moved her belongings into the Double F the following week, and Georgia Hayes became Joel Fairchild, and the empty rooms of the ranch house, the rooms that had echoed for 10 years, were no longer empty. She put books in the front room and her locked box, now empty of its terrible documents, on the mantelpiece, as a reminder of something she was proud of. She put her saddle beside his in the tack room. She continued teaching at the Redemption School because she loved it, and because the school needed her, and because Joel would never have asked her to stop. He would not have thought to ask her to stop. She found this out early and loved him more for it. The spring of 1883 was a good one. The winter had been cold but not brutal, and the creek ran clear and full into April, and the cattle were in good health, and the Double F calved out a strong season. Georgia helped with the calving when she was not at school, because she had grown up with a practical understanding of animals, and because she liked working alongside him, liked the competent, comfortable partnership of it, two people who trusted each other's capabilities working toward the same goal. There were hard things too, because there are always hard things. A drought in the late summer of 1883 was bad enough that they had to move cattle to higher pasture, and cut hay at a loss and worry in the particular grinding way that ranchers worried, which was constant and systematic, and had to be set aside each evening in order to sleep. Georgia took this the same way she took most things, practically and without panic, which was a relief to him in a way he had not expected because Alice had been a woman who wept easily, and he had never quite known how to meet that. But George's steadiness under pressure was something he found deeply, specifically comforting, and he told her so one night, and she had looked at him with an expression that was affectionate and slightly exasperated and said, "I prefer when you just tell me things, Joel, rather than waiting until it builds into a speech." And he had laughed and agreed that yes, he probably did let things build. They were good at talking, and occasionally needed to remind themselves that talking included talking about the uncomfortable things as well as the things that came naturally. There was a difficult week in the autumn of 1883, about 8 months into their marriage, when Joel's old wound came up in a way neither of them had anticipated. Not about Alice exactly, but about the years of building a life in anticipation of someone who never arrived. And he came home from a long day at the upper fence line, closed up and flat in a way she recognized as pain rather than anger. And she sat with him on the porch and waited. And eventually, he told her that he had ridden past the spot on the creek where he had, once, a very long time ago, sat for half a night trying to decide whether to keep building or to leave Wyoming altogether, and that riding past it had landed on him in a way he had not expected. She listened. She did not solve it or minimize it. She said, "I'm glad you stayed." He looked at her. "So am I," he said. "God, Georgia. So am I." She reached over and put her hand on the back of his neck, gently, the way you touch someone you want to reach without words, and they sat together until the dark came down and the stars came out above the wind rivers, and in the morning he was himself again. Their first child was born in November of 1884, a boy, 7 pounds and intensely opinionated about the experience from his first breath, and they named him William Daniel Fairchild. William for no one in particular and Daniel for George's father, who had been a school teacher and deserved to be remembered. Joel was present for the birth, which was not universally standard for the era but was not negotiable as far as Georgia was concerned, and she had said so to the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Acaffer who had come from the settlement community east of Redemption, and Mrs. Acaffer had given her a look of complete approval and told Joel he would do fine as long as he kept out of the way and did not faint. He did not faint. He held George's hand through the worst of it and said exactly nothing, which was what she needed. And when William arrived, red-faced and furious and absolutely present in the world, Joel looked at him, and then at Georgia with an expression she had never seen on a human face before and hoped never to see elsewhere, because it was too particular, too entirely his, and she had thought absurdly through her exhaustion that it was the best use of a face she had ever witnessed. William was a good baby, which meant a baby who slept in intervals of more than 2 hours and took to feeding without drama. He was also, from very early, a child who observed. He watched things. He had George's brown eyes and Joel's capacity for stillness, and by the time he was sitting up and exploring the ranch house with the focused determination of a small person who intends to understand everything, both of his parents recognized in him a quality that made them look at each other across his head with the private communication of people who know exactly what they are seeing. The years moved. They were good years, with the rhythms that good years have, which are not the rhythms of constant happiness, but of consistent meaning, work and weather and seasons, and the small accumulations of a life that is genuinely lived. Cal Briggs married a woman named Rose who had come to the basin as a nurse and stayed because she liked the mountains, and the Briggses took the foreman's cottage and became the particular kind of neighbors who are close enough to be family but maintain enough distance to be a relief. Hazel Prout expanded the general store and hired 2 assistants and finally had the boarding house kitchen renovated, which she had been threatening to do for years. The school in Redemption grew, and Georgia eventually had an assistant teacher, a young woman named Patience Crow, who had grown up in one of the Shoshone-adjacent communities along the Wind River, and had a gift for teaching the younger children that Georgia recognized and nurtured deliberately, because she believed in leaving things better than you found them. In the autumn of 1886, a second son was born. They named him Robert Miles, and he was louder than William had been, faster to laugh and faster to cry and physically incapable of sitting still, which made the ranch house considerably more interesting and occasionally considerably louder. Joel observed that Robert seemed to have inherited something from a branch of both their families that specialized in making its opinions known at volume, and Georgia said that was the most diplomatic way she had ever heard anyone describe a child who required creative parenting. And Joel said creative parenting seemed to be working fine, and she agreed that it seemed to be. In the summer of 1887, 5 years after Georgia Hayes had ridden into redemption on a borrowed horse with a carpetbag and a secret. She was sitting on the double F porch on a June evening with William on the step below her working through a geography lesson and Robert asleep inside, and Joel coming up from the barn with the particular walk that meant a long day well finished. And she looked at all of this. The mountains in the last light, the creek audible below, the candles lit inside through the window. And she thought about a night 5 years ago when every candle in this house had been lit for her. And she thought about what it had meant to ride down that hill and see those lit windows and understand what they were saying. Joel came up onto the porch and sat beside her, and William showed him the geography lesson. And Joel asked him 2 questions about the Wind River Range that were not in the lesson, but were things William needed to know if he was going to grow up in these mountains. And William absorbed this information with the focused seriousness of a child who understood that his father's knowledge was worth gathering. Then William went inside to wash up for supper, and Joel and Georgia were alone on the porch in the June dark, and she leaned her shoulder into his arm, and he put his arm around her, and they sat quietly watching the first stars come out. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About what I want next," she said. "For the school, for the land, for us." "Tell me," he said. "I think we should petition the territorial government for an expansion of the school district," she said. "There are children in the settlements east of here who are riding 12 miles to school and 12 miles back, and by winter that's impossible and they're losing months of education. If we can establish a secondary schoolhouse closer to them, with Patience Crow as the primary teacher, it would make an enormous difference." "All right," he said. "How can I help? I'll need your signature on the petition as a landowner. And your voice with the other ranchers, because several of them are skeptical of the idea and they'll listen to you when they might not listen to me." "Done," he said. "What else?" "I want to buy the Alderman parcel," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The Alderman parcel, the 30 acres on Copper Ridge with the creek right-of-way that Cormac Slade had been eyeing when he came to redemption, had been available since Slade's arrest had collapsed the transaction. It had sat on the market for years, caught in a legal tangle related to the fraud investigation, and had only recently been cleared for sale. "That's a good piece of land," he said carefully. "It's more than a good piece of land," she said. "The creek right-of-way on it controls the water access for the upper pasture. You've been working around it for 5 years because you didn't want to press Alderman while the land was tied up." He looked at her sideways. "Have you been watching my property management?" "I've been watching everything," she said. "I have also," she added, "been setting aside a portion of my teaching salary for 4 years, because I have my own money and I want to contribute to this purchase. And I want you to accept that contribution without making it an occasion for a speech about how you can manage it yourself." "I wasn't going to make a speech," he said. "You had the look of someone about to make a speech." "I had the look of someone who is moved and also trying to calculate acreage," he said. She laughed. "Can you do both?" "I'm trying," he said, and the particular choice of those words, the same words he had said to her years ago on a summer porch when she had called him a good man, landed between them with all their accumulated meaning, and she turned her head and kissed him on the jaw and then leaned back into the warm, solid fact of his arm around her. "Joel," she said. "Yes." "I want you to know something," she said. "This, all of this, it is the best choice I have ever made." He held her more tightly. Outside, the June dark was full of cricket song, and the creek was running somewhere below, and inside the house William was probably interrogating the kitchen in advance of supper, and Robert was probably about to wake from his nap with opinions, and all of it was real and true and entirely, completely theirs. "Georgia," he said. "Yes. You are the bravest person I know," he said, "and the sharpest. And the most difficult person to argue with in the entire Wind River Basin, which is saying something because Cal Briggs's wife once argued a cattle buyer down by 40% and sent him home confused. That is the most Joel Fairchild compliment I have ever received," she said. "There's also the fact that I would do anything for you," he said more quietly. "Anything you needed. Go anywhere, fight anything, wait as long as it took. I want you to know that too." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I know, I've always known, that's why I came down from that ridge." He was still. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, turning to look at him in the blue dark of the porch, "that when I saw the candles in the windows, I knew you had been sitting in that house for 3 days not knowing, and your answer was to light every candle you owned and keep the house warm and wait for me. And I thought, that is the man I want to ride toward for the rest of my life." She paused. "That is why I came down." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he pulled her close and pressed his mouth against the top of her head, and they stayed like that on the porch of the Double F Ranch house, while the stars came all the way out above the Wind River Mountains, and the June night settled warm and full around them. The school district petition was submitted to the Wyoming territorial government in the autumn of 1887 and approved in the spring of 1888, a fact that Georgia received via letter with characteristic understatement, and then celebrated alone in the schoolhouse by sitting at her desk for 5 minutes doing absolutely nothing, which was her version of a victory dance. The secondary schoolhouse was constructed that summer by a community effort involving ranching families from the eastern settlements and several Shoshone community members, who contributed both labor and considerable knowledge of how to build structures that would stand up to Wind River winters. Patience Crow became the primary teacher of the secondary school, and in her first year served 43 students who had previously had no reliable access to formal education, a number that Georgia put in a letter to Agent Marcus Webb in Creston, along with her thanks for his work on the Laramie fraud case, because she felt he deserved to know that the downstream effects of righting old wrongs could reach further than anyone expected. The Alderman parcel was purchased in the autumn of 1887, registered jointly in both Joel and Georgia Fairchild's names, which was unusual for the era, and required the land office clerk to consult with his supervisor before processing the paperwork, but which was accomplished in the end because the law as it stood in Wyoming territory in 1887 did permit joint property ownership by married couples, and neither Joel nor Georgia was willing to proceed on any other basis. They rode up to Copper Ridge together the first weekend after the purchase was finalized, just the two of them, leaving William and Robert in Hazel Pruitt's capable and enthusiastic care. They rode up through the same pine timber Georgia had chased Juniper through in the dark 5 years before, and she pointed out the boulder windbreak where she had spent the last cold hours of that night, and he looked at it for a moment with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he was feeling something that was going to take him a while to process. At the top of the ridge the wind was cold and clean, and the view stretched south and west across the whole Wind River basin, the ranches laid out below like a patchwork quilt, the town of Redemption a collection of dark rooftops along the main road, and somewhere among those rooftops the schoolhouse roof, which was solid and well-maintained because Georgia had made the school board address it the previous spring. Beyond the basin, the Wind River Range stood enormous and indifferent, and beautiful in the way that things older than human concern are beautiful. They stood at the top of the ridge with their horses behind them and the wind in their faces, and Joel put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they looked at all of it for a long time without speaking, because some views are too large for anything but the physical fact of your own smallness before them, which was not a frightening smallness but a clarifying one. "This is ours," she said. "Yes," he said. "I did not think 5 years ago," she said, "that I would ever be able to say a sentence like that and mean it the way I mean it." "What did you think 5 years ago?" he asked. She considered. "I thought I was starting over. I thought I was trying to make something functional from the wreckage. I did not think," she said carefully, "that I was actually beginning, that the whole real thing was still ahead of me." She looked up at him. "I was wrong." He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "You were never wreckage," he said. "You were the whole time exactly what you are now, Georgia. I just had to wait until you could see it." She reached up and put her hand against his face, and he turned his head and pressed his lips against her palm. And the wind came up the ridge and moved through the pine timber below them, and carried with it the smell of the creek and the coming winter and the whole enormous possibility of the open land. They rode back down in the late afternoon, and the valley came up to meet them golden and wide, and the double F came into view below with its good solid walls and its stone chimney, and the creek glittering beside it. And Georgia thought about that long-ago evening riding toward lit windows through amber grass, and felt the echo of the gratitude that had moved through her then. She thought about all the things a woman could build when no one was trying to stop her. She thought about the school and the petition and the documents in Agent Webb's files, and the 3 families in Laramie County with their land back. She thought about William at his geography lesson, and Robert's magnificent vocal opinions, and Joel's hands on her face in candlelight. She thought about the plain gold ring on her finger, and the joint deed to the alderman parcel, and the locked box on the mantelpiece that had traveled from under a floorboard in Laramie to the top of Copper Ridge to the shelf, in Agent Webb's office to the place of honor in her own home, emptied of fear, and filled instead with the simple meaning of something finished. A life was a strange and enormous thing when you actually let yourself live it, she thought. It was so much more than the careful small things she had been making for herself in those first years after Fletcher, the just-enough life, the survival-shaped life. This was not survival. This was not careful and small. This was large and full and lit from within, the way the ranch house had been lit that October night 5 years ago, warm and present and visible from a long way off. She came down off Copper Ridge in the golden afternoon and rode through her own gate on her own land beside the man she had chosen, freely and fully, with her whole heart. And the valley held them in its great palm, and the mountains stood behind them, and the double F lay ahead with smoke already beginning to drift from the chimney because Hazel had come early with the boys and started a fire. And somewhere inside the house, she could already hear Robert's decisive vocal presence and William's steadier commentary. And all of it was entirely, completely, permanently hers. In the years that followed, the double F grew, and the school expanded, and the Fairchild family added a daughter, Clara Ann, born in the summer of 1889, named partly for the Clara Riley who had once served as their enthusiastic chaperone, and partly because Georgia had wanted a name that felt like sunlight, which Clara Ann proved to be from her first month of life, a child of enormous good humor and physical fearlessness, who would grow up to ride better than anyone in the valley and to argue, with the calm precision of her mother, for everything she believed in. William grew into a young man who had his father's patience and his mother's sharpness and became, eventually, an attorney in Cheyenne who handled land rights cases for farming and ranching families and indigenous communities whose land claims were being challenged. A career that Georgia had watched develop with the quiet pride of a woman who understood that the children you raise are the most significant and lasting thing you make. Robert grew into a man who loved the outdoors and the cattle and the mountains with an intensity that was physical and absolute, and who took over the operational management of the double F with a capability that left Joel and Georgia free, in their later years, to ride and to read, and to sit on the porch in the evenings without the constant urgency of the ranch pressing against every hour. Clara Ann married the youngest Briggs boy, who had grown up to be a good and straightforward man very like his father, and they built their own place a mile up the creek, which was near enough for Sunday dinners and far enough for privacy, and Georgia and Joel became grandparents with the same quality of full attention they had brought to everything else, loving the grandchildren with the particular generous ease of people who had already done the hard work of building and could now simply be present for the joy of it. On their 25th anniversary, in the February of 1908, Joel and Georgia rode up to Copper Ridge one more time. They were older. The ridge was the same. The valley below was both the same and different, more settled now, the territorial days behind them, Wyoming a proper state for nearly 20 years, the Wild West of dime novels receding into the romantic past, while the actual West continued with all its complexity and beauty and injustice and hope, much as it always had. They stood at the top of the ridge in the February cold with their breath-making clouds and the Wind River Range enormous and white with snow against a hard blue sky. And Joel held her hand in both of his, and she looked up at him and he looked down at her. And everything they had been through was between them like a country they had traveled together, every mile of it known and mapped. 25 years, she said. 25 years, he said. Any regrets? She asked. Not one, he said immediately, and she believed him because she knew him, and because the same was true for her with a completeness that required no qualification. She leaned up and kissed him in the cold February air at the top of Copper Ridge, and the wind moved through the pine timber below them as it always had, and the valley held them, and the mountain stood, and the ranch house was down there below with its lit windows and its stone chimney, and its 34 years of being a home that someone had built and then filled, against all reasonable expectation, with everything it had ever needed. She had ridden down from this ridge once, toward lit windows, toward a man who had waited, and in doing so she had ridden toward the whole of her life. She had never once wished she had turned the other way. They rode back down together through the amber grass and the cold winter light, side by side, the way they had ridden for 25 years, and the double F came into view below, and there were already lights in the windows because Robert had come up from the barn, and they came through the gate together as the last light went out of the sky, and the first stars came over the Wind River Range, and Georgia Fairchild looked at the lit windows of her home and felt, as she always felt when she came back to this place, that gratitude that had no bottom to it. The gratitude of a woman who knew the exact cost of everything she had and had paid it willingly and would pay it again, 1,000 times, 1,000 different ways, for the life she had chosen and the man she had chosen it with, and the lit windows waiting at the end of every ride home. The door opened before they reached it, as it always did, because Joel Fairchild had a gift for knowing when she was coming, had always had that gift, had lit candles by it and waited by it and built a life by it, and he stood in the warm doorway with the light behind him, and she swung down from the saddle and walked to him, and he held the door wide and she went inside, home, warm, lit, complete.